Listen, thanks everybody. Look, what a wonderful event. Anthropology has been at the vanguard, I don't think that's the wrong word, of the college in your commitment to social justice, in your commitment to activism, your emphasis on public anthropology and other forms. And this is just a tremendous way to recognize people who have been able to coalesce the fruits of their research and their commitments to trying to change the world into the solid achievement of a book that many of them are getting a lot of circulation and really helping to make a difference, making immediate improvements in the lives of their readers, as well as contributing to such important debates and efforts and social movements in the diversity of topics. I especially want to congratulate Annie and Rebecca and Siobhán and Adrienne and Kareem and David and Buck for what you've done here, and also the whole community, because this represents what anthropology contributes to the college and to the university, to many more overlapping and intersecting communities as well. So thank you for putting this on. Thank you for your wonderful work, your dedication, the exhaustion that you've been coping with in making these things happen under increasingly adverse circumstances. Thank you for being the living example of why AU gets to talk about how we help to produce change makers for a changing world. Some of us really do that. Some of you really do that. And that's embodied and celebrated today. I wish I could stay for the whole thing. I'll be able to stay for a few minutes, but thanks again. And thanks to everyone else who came to support our authors and to continue to represent the community at large that has benefited from their work.
All right, well, thank you, Max. I'm Dan Sayers, chair of the Department of Anthropology, and welcome to echo what Max said, and thanks for coming to this special program, Scholarship to Change the World, New Books in Public Anthropology. It's intended as a celebration and discussion of books recently published or soon to be published by department faculty. We are especially excited because two of the authors, Rebecca Gibson and Siobhán McGuirk, are alums of the department's PhD program. Just quick ideas on what to expect. It's going to be a fast-paced discussion of the books, some of the inspiration behind the books, and what the authors hope the books will accomplish in the world. Each of the authors will briefly answer a couple questions that they each pose among themselves to one another, and then we will open, or they will open things up to questions from all of us in the audience. So feel free to pose questions at any point in the chat if pressing enough, of course. And then last but not least, although this perhaps will take a minute, but nonetheless, I'm going to let you know a little bit about the authors, particularly the titles of the books they're going to be discussing today. We have Annie, no particular order here. I don't know if this is going to be the order in which people present, but the authors will sort that out for us in a minute. But Annie Kloss is the author of Drawing the Sea Near, Satumi, and Coral Reef Conservation in Okinawa, which came out in the fall of 2020 from the University of Minnesota Press. Kareem Rabie is the author of Palestine is Throwing a Party and the Whole World is Invited, Capitol and State Building in the West Bank, and this is coming out in early May from Duke University Press. Rebecca Gibson is the author of The Corseted Skeleton, a bioarchaeology of binding, which came out in November 2020 from Palgrave Macmillan. Buck Woodard is the author of Building the Brafferton, the Founding, Funding, and Legacy of America's Indian School, which came out in the fall of 2019 from the Muscarelli Museum of Art at William and Mary. Adrienne Pine is the co-editor of Asylum for Sale, Profit and Protest in the Migration Industry, which was released in November 2020 by PM Press. Siobhán McGuirk graduated from AU with a PhD in anthropology in 2017. She is the author, she's the other co-editor of Asylum for Sale, Profit and Protest in the Migration Industry. Manissa Maharawal is co-editor and collective member of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which has produced Counterpoints, a San Francisco Bay Area atlas of displacement and resistance. The book will be out in July from PM Press. And last but not least, of course, David Vine is the author of The United States of War, a global history of America's endless conflicts from Columbus to the Islamic State, which came out last October. So once again, thanks everyone for joining us today. And now we will turn our attention to these wonderful authors and colleagues and hear what they have to say about their books and inspirations and such.
Welcome, everyone. My name is David Vine, for those who don't know me. Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you so much to Dean Max Paul Friedman for kicking us off. And thank you so much to the entire College of Arts and Sciences and AU for helping to make this event possible. I also want to thank Jeannie Wogeman, who is the fantastic senior administrative assistant in our department, and without whom nothing goes on in our department. So thank you to her and to Haley Jardis. Thanks to the folks providing captioning today and who made that possible as well. In an event, about anthropology, it does also strike me as it's important to, given the colonial history of anthropology, it seems important, particularly important, to acknowledge the indigenous peoples of the lands that American University occupies, the Piscataway, Pamunkey, and Nacotchtank, as well as other indigenous peoples and groups who have either lived previously or currently occupy the land where American University is located. As Dan said, we are going to keep this lively. We have a lot of folks, a lot of books. I'm going to give you an image of the cover of each of the books as the speakers initially get started, but each person is going to answer basically 2 questions very briefly, and then we're going to open things up to your questions. Either you can put questions in the chat, or we'll also encourage people to unmute themselves and ask questions, and we very much look forward to a lively discussion that follows. It is, worth saying that, the title of the event, Scholarship to Change the World, you might say it's perhaps lacks a certain humility, or that's a lot of chutzpah, but then again, what good is scholarship really if it doesn't seek to change the world? So we look forward to the discussion of both the ways that our authors today are seeking to change the world, and perhaps a broader conversation and discussion about how anthropology and scholarship more broadly can change the world, a world that so desperately needs changing, of course. So with that, Siobhán is a big football or soccer fan, so I thought she would be a great person to kick us off, so to speak. The subtitle of Siobhán's book, and now let me make sure that you can see the cover of the book. Fantastic cover. Asylum for Sale, Profit and Protest in the Migration Industry explicitly references protest, social, and implicitly alludes to social movements and change. Siobhán, maybe you could start us off by talking about some of the inspiration for your book and the work that went into it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for everyone coming to our event today. And also I should say, I'm a co-editor of this book, so I'm one of many more authors than are credited on the front cover. So thank you to all of those authors as well. To explain how the book came together, I was doing my PhD at American University under the supervision of Adrienne and we were talking about my work, which focused around LGBTQ people who were seeking asylum in the United States, and Adrienne's own work as an expert witness in asylum cases in DC. And in talking about my dissertation as it's developing, and this is a great encouragement for people to be expansive in your relationships with your supervisors and look beyond just the dissertation. But we were talking about what we were seeing in our work as it pertains to the way that capital was being generated around asylum seekers. So as well as questions about legal obligations and moral obligations that surround refugees and asylum seekers, we were becoming increasingly aware of how capital was generated from those people or around those people, whether it was the private or for-profit detention centres, the companies building fences or walls, and the expert witnesses, the lawyers, but also people who worked in NGOs, the kind of social capital or professional capital that they built from doing that work. And I think it's important to mention here that this was in 2015, so this was pre-Trump, this was under the deporter-in-chief Barack Obama, as he was then known, and during the kind of attention on the Mediterranean and around Europe with the so-called migrant crisis or refugee crisis of that time. And so we wanted to kind of push the conversation a little bit and bring together lots of different voices, the kind of people we wanted to contribute to the volume. We also wanted to be the readers of the volume. So we invited people who have themselves sought asylum, people who've worked inside NGOs or still working as lawyers or as social workers. There's a story from Guard of one of the detention centres in Australia, journalists, people coming from all different angles. And this is another reason that we went with, we wanted to go with a non-academic press, because we wanted the book to be affordable and on the radars of this kind of really broad cast of similar people who'd been contributing, and so, as I said, would become the readers. And hopefully it's had that effect. And the final thing I'll say is that based on that kind of wanting to have a wide reach, we wanted to think of different ways of writing, or not only writing, but of drawing, of telling stories through images, whether photographs or graphic novella or paintings, or even using tweets to tell a story. And so hopefully the book achieves some of those goals. To end on a footballing analogy.
Thank you so much, Siobhán, and thank you for keeping it to 2 minutes. Now we're going to turn to Manissa. Manissa's work is also deeply engaged with activist movements, and I wonder if you could now speak to some of the inspiration for your collaborative book and some of the work and background and research that went into it.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, David. And also, I just want to say I'm so honored and proud of our department and all this like wonderful work. And thank you for putting this together, David. So the book that I also co-edited with the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which I guess I'll just first say is an activist mapping collective that I've been a member of since 2013. Based out of the Bay Area. We now also have chapters in LA and New York, but the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project started in the San Francisco Bay Area, and the project started, like I said, in 2013 to map the displacement that was happening. The Bay Area has had a housing and eviction crisis for the past 10 years, basically at this point. And we started making maps to show that. Our first map was a map of evictions in the city. And we started making those maps in order to further activist causes around housing, housing rights, tenant laws, to stop people's actual evictions. And that first map really led to what is now over like, I think 200 maps on our website. Of both evictions we have mapped police violence, we've mapped race in the Bay Area, we've mapped investors, we've mapped everything. And so basically the inspiration for writing this book was to take those maps, which entirely all live online on our website, but to take them and put them in a print form and to put them alongside essays. So I co-edited this book with the project. There's There's about 6 of us who bottom line different chapters. And what we basically did was we took a bunch of the maps from that we've been working on since 2013, and we asked activists, residents, artists from the Bay Area to write essays, tell stories, draw pictures, to put them alongside our maps. So we really wanted to like build out our maps into not just a critical geography project, which this is, but also to sort of like add in a lot of the stories and analysis from activists. So this is our atlas. We decided to make an atlas. We have chapters that range from, the first chapter is about eviction, to indigenous geographies of resistance, health and environmental justice, state violence, transportation, infrastructure and economy, migration, relocation, and then also speculation and speculative futures. So we kind of also envisioned this as a way to expand our work beyond just mapping, to offer these like different levels of analysis about what has been happening in the Bay Area, and to really offer both a political, economic, and critical geographic look at the Bay Area, but alongside, like I said, stories, oral histories, pictures, paintings, stuff like that. We also published it with PM Press, just like Siobhán and Adrienne's book. And so we went with a popular press so that, this book could be accessible. We did a lot of fundraising because it's all color to make it the price point low for like a 200-page all color book. And so we're really excited about, getting it in people's hands. It comes out this summer. And just offering what we think is like a really deep analysis of this place and, the problem of displacement, but also like the deep levels of resistance that have been happening over the past 10 years. So I will stop there. Happy to answer any questions. I also have a bunch of visuals. If anyone wants to see any of the pictures or any of the maps or pictures from the book, I can happy to show those during the question and answer as well. But thank you.
Thank you so much, Manissa. I want to now shift to Buck Woodard, who also, of course, has long been interested in issues of displacement and dispossession, to talk about the inspiration for his book and some of the background and work that was involved.
Thanks, David, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm happy to be included in this talk today. This project, called Building the Brafferton, first I should say, even though it has a building on the front cover, it's not about a building. The project started over 15 years ago in an institutional reassessment by the College of William and Mary with regards to its relationship to Native peoples. Some may not know, but William and Mary and Harvard, the two oldest higher education institutions in the US, were both started as Indian schools. And as part of that reassessment, at the time I was in graduate school and worked for the American Indian Resource Center, began to do some cursory research to find out more about the narrative of this school, but also to better understand the students who went there. And as that research began, saw some conflicting reports with regards to whether Native peoples, were successfully educated, or what kind of agency they had in engaging the school and trying to find out more about the histories of the tribes that went there, and came to some conclusions that there, one, had been a real misunderstanding about the school historically, quite a bit of forgetting in terms of memory about the school and its relationship to the infrastructure of colonialism, and that there could be, based on field work with Native communities, divergent perspectives about the school. It wasn't a 19th century boarding school, for instance, and so its role during the colonial period seemed to be of a different character. And in the early 2000s, the institution renovated this structure, which today is the President's House for the College of William and Mary. The President's Office for the College of William and Mary. The President's House sits across from it. And that renovation provided us an opportunity for public archaeology to re-engage Native communities who were descendant communities of the residents at this building, which began a project of several years of doing archaeology around the building and a restoration of the building. Ultimately, some of this led to the employment of Native community members on campus, at this university, but also there's a museum across the street called Colonial Williamsburg, which I at that time directed a project there. And so the book is a documentation of probably 10 years worth of research and public engagement with Native communities that were formerly in the East, but as an outcome of colonialism, in most cases have been removed beyond the Mississippi. And it is a record of an exhibition that we put together in 2017. And in that way, it's a collaborative text. I'm the author of a series of the chapters, but like others that have said, we've invited people to be a part of this. And I'm a co-editor of organizing an interdisciplinary volume that has archaeology, anthropology, architecture, art history. And so the book is a documentation both of the exhibition, the symposium that we held, the speaker series, and all the Native communities that came to participate in the various projects and programs over the course of about 10 years. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Buck. Kareem, your work, of course, also takes place in a colonized space. So I wonder if you might jump in next to talk about the inspiration for your book and some of the background and work that was involved.
Sure. First of all, thanks, David, for organizing. Thanks to the department. I'm also very proud of our department. One quick thing, I am sort of experiencing kind of a sinus infection. So if there's question and answer and I mishear, just correct me. My inspiration for writing this was very simple. I felt like many of the narratives about Palestine, whether in media of course, but also scholarly, didn't really do justice to what was happening there. Too many accounts kind of seemed to focus on things that were very visible, in particular framed around this binary of violence and resistance. So what I want to ask was, what are Palestinians doing to formalize the present conditions, and what it might mean for the future there, and for the possibilities for a just and humane solution to this ongoing political problem. Now, I did my main stretch of research over the course of about a year and a half in the field. I went back on average annually from 2007 to 2017 or so. And what I did is I interviewed real estate developers, finance capitalists, bureaucrats, ordinary Palestinians, and came up with a study of how privatization is interacting with state building there. And now, as for my hopes for this, they're modest. I think what I'm really doing is just telling an undertold story and engaging sort of that story and the existing academic literature from a bit of a different angle. Now, I don't think that what I wrote is going to surprise anybody who's there, although I do have sections about internal politics. But what I hope I can do is to slowly and in some small way sort of influence the production of ideas about Palestine through the focus and the way that I'm sort of telling it. So thanks again.
Annie, I think there are connections to your work in many of the books we've heard about, but the contribution to the production of ideas about conservation and conservation practice is certainly at the focus of your book. Maybe you could talk a bit about the inspiration and the work that went into drawing the scene near.
Sure. Thanks, David. And thanks again for organizing this event. It's pretty awesome to see everyone talking about our books together. So this book is an institutional ethnography that really looks at how the practices of conservation organization, one of the world's largest conservation organizations, changed. You may have heard about the destructive practices of these large conservation organizations and how they're really implicated in displacement and violence, in a lot of undesirable cultural change. And in fact, the underlying work of these organizations involves a lot of complicated dynamics that relate to their organizational structure, which really depends on funding and expertise coming from the quote unquote global north, where wilderness ideologies remain strong. So the book is really analyzing the work of a field station of the World Wildlife Fund, where practices shifted from this wilderness-based ideology to a form of conservation that is much more socially just and collaborative. And I call that kind of conservation near. there have been ample critiques of transnational conservation organizations, but there aren't a lot of examples of how these organizations change. And so this book is really unpacking those transformations in detail. It's in Japan. I went to Okinawa to do this research. And another thing that I think is distinct about the approach that I take in the book is that most previous anthropology of conservation is really focusing on local communities themselves. And this book really focuses in on the conservationists. I spent 18 months in Japan, mostly in Ishigaki, which is in Western Okinawa, but also across the entire archipelago, attending a lot of conservation meetings, doing some internships with conservation organizations, and also spending a lot of time in the nearshore sea. I was primarily located in one very small village located on the east coast of Ishigaki. And there I also spent a lot of time with local residents and other people who are around the island who work in conservation. And in that work, I was trying to see the ways that the work of the organization WWF is interpreted and understood by others.
Thank you. And maybe I'll turn things over to Rebecca Gibson, who I should also say I left to last because she will be helping to moderate the Q&A in a few moments. I'm already excited for the questions that I'm sure folks will have because of the number of themes that are emerging and commonalities and connections between the works. But Rebecca, a few words about your inspiration and the work that went into it.
Absolutely. So my primary inspiration for the corseted skeleton was just an intense fascination with both corsets and skeletons. But when I first proposed this work as a master's student, it was basically dismissed as basically as women's work, as we don't need to know what corsets did to skeletons. We already understand that subject, even though there had been no published work on the subject at all. So that sort of redoubled my determination to look at this and to look at why we don't treat this, this subject, this body modification subject that also ties in really closely to agency, more seriously. So the corseted skeleton, a bioarchaeology of binding, is a work that focuses on a cemetery collection in the Museum of London. It is the St. Bride's Lower Churchyard Cemetery collection, which has over 125 female skeletons, which I looked at to collect data for this book. I also looked at male skeletons from the same time period and location as a as sort of a counterbalance to that, to see what would be anatomically normal for a skeleton that would not have worn a corset during this time period. And by looking at this, what I found was that women who corseted had long lives. I found that they are medically dismissed and socially dismissed both during this time period, which is the 17 and 1800s, and our time period now. And I found that I could really bring the unheard voices of this particular community of women to light by looking at the lives that they lived while corseting, the ways that they use their corsets as a form of self-expression, and how they use their agency in the ways that they used their corsets. It really emphasized how we often discuss groups of people, whether it's cultures or genders or anything else, races, anything like that, as monoliths, as having one idea about how to do things. But that is not accurate at all. And we need to inject more nuance into the discussion and really think about what people were actually doing instead of thinking about them as a group. So the corseted skeleton was the culmination of 10 years worth of work, both my master's degree and my PhD, plus some extra research afterwards. And it is the first large-scale, multi-site bioarchaeological study of corseted women.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I'm going to use my privilege as the moderator to ask one more question of the authors and then open things up to everyone else. I'm going to ask our authors to, and this time in just 1 minute, given that we've gone a little bit longer than we intended with the first question. So in 1 minute, I'm going to ask each of our authors to explain what they want readers to take away from their book and what they want and hope their book will accomplish and do in the world. I'll just say very briefly about my book. The honest truth about my book is that I had material from a prior book that hit the cutting room floor, and it was just too painful to see it disappear. So initially, this book, The United States of War, was just a series of what looked to be chapters that were loosely connected and thematically connected around war and US military bases abroad. And then I had this light bulb moment where I realized, no, wait, I actually have a full history. I can, with some additional research and writing, tell a full history of US wars since independence, and indeed since Columbus's arrival at Guantanamo Bay in 1494. Ultimately, this led to additional research building on 19 years of research with the US military, with US government officials, and importantly, with movements around the world that are opposed to the presence of US military bases on their soil, beginning with research with the Chagosian people, the exiled Chagosian people from Diego Garcia. Ultimately, I hope the book makes some contribution to a range of movements, including those anti-base movements and the Chagosians movement to return to their homeland. In addition, I hope this book makes contributions to movements to end the endless wars that the United States is currently engaged in, the larger anti-war peace movement, movement to dramatically cut the size of the US military budget, which now is around $1 trillion a year, and to move money to the human needs that are so desperately in need of funding, as COVID has only underlined so painfully, as well as larger movements to roll back the power of the military industrial complex. Let me stop there and turn back to our fantastic authors. Rebecca, why don't we go sort of in reverse order, although I may go out of that order just to, again, hopefully underline some of the really fantastic thematic connections between the books. But Rebecca, yeah, what do you most want your book to accomplish, and what do you want readers to take away?
I want to sort of have it start a discussion about our assumptions about women's roles in society. Those assumptions very much stem from this time period, from the 1700s and the 1800s and the early 1900s. And the way we talk about women comes directly from this time period. The way we talk about gender comes directly from this time period. And we use terms like uptight or loosen up, or who wears the pants in the family, and we need to think about what that language is doing. And we think women are too emotional or too weak, and that comes from this idea of corsets causing that weakness, causing women to be damaged in some way. So I want them to re-examine their ideas about femininity and carry those ideas forward into the ways we discuss women and gender in general.
Thank you. Thank you for being so concise. Maybe we could jump to Buck. Buck, maybe you could say a few words about what you most want the book to accomplish and readers to take away.
Thank you, David. And yeah, one thing I hear a lot about is decolonization. And in order to move in the direction of decolonization, we have to restore some measure of indigeneity to different spaces. And so one of the book is a historical ethnography, and does review the institutional history and role of Native peoples with different entities, be they the church, the college, or the colonial state, but it's as an outcome of the revolution that Native peoples, the memory of Native peoples in many cases have been erased from the original homeland here on the Eastern Seaboard. So another takeaway is for people that engage with what is a very richly illustrated volume, is to see Native peoples in those spaces in the late 17th, 18th century, and to also see the interest of the Native gaze looking back to original homelands in re-engaging spaces here in Virginia, for instance, or re-engaging institutions that have a historical relationship, and that the importance of those long-term, that's one of the quotes that's in the book from one of our Bradford and Legacy members. It's not about a building, it's about the relationships between people and among people. And that's what we want to focus on, is thinking about our historical relationships and what opportunities there are for the present. And I think that's what the book illustrates, what could be and which directions we could move in some of those institutional nation relationships. Thanks.
Thank you for stating it so powerfully. Annie, maybe you could talk about relationships are at the center of your book, I think. If you could say what you would like readers to take away, and perhaps what you'd like the book to accomplish.
Sure. Thanks, David. Anthropology, like many other disciplines, has until very recently been terracentric. And so one thing that I hope readers emerge with from reading my book is a better sense of the sea, the Okinawan Sea in particular. There are diverse interpretations of how the sea is made meaningful, and they appear in the book in these interstitial chapters that are situated between the more analytically oriented chapters about conservation practices and processes. The main aim of the book really, though, is to target transnational conservation organizations and their practices. And I purposely wrote a book that is very light on jargon. I don't know if we can say that as anthropologists because we have a lot of jargon, but I did attempt to do that in this book so that it could be accessible to people who work on or with conservation organizations. So in that, I really hope that it is seen as a work of public anthropology. It seeks to join the works of many others who, in both their scholarship and practice, have attempted to change the practices of those organizations.
Cool. Thank you so much, Annie. That's fantastic. Kareem, maybe you could share a few words about what you'd like readers to take away the book to accomplish.
Sure. Thank you, David. I touched on this a little bit in my original comments, so I'll just say now that, like Annie, I did my best to make this a readable text for people who aren't sort of knee deep in anthropology and anthropology jargon. And I guess what I was kind of swimming around a little bit in my earlier comments is that there's really a lot of sort of aggregate knowledge, information, ideology in any conversation about Israel and Palestine. And I tried my best to sort of tell a different story and sort of describe a different reality that I think is I think has political validity and also sort of is maybe a little bit more right than a lot of the things that we tend to see, and just to show, to tell a story that's untold there, but that has really sort of meaningful, productive qualities that impact life there, and also the sort of possibilities for a political solution to what's going on between in the West Bank and with respect to Israel and the rest of its occupation. So that was my goal.
Thank you so much, Kareem. Manissa.
Yeah, sure. Hi. So, like I said earlier, this collective I've been a part of, all our maps have lived online. And so with this, we really wanted to broaden our analysis and also make we were taking the materiality of print very seriously, in the sense that we wanted to make an atlas, like a print atlas that documents not only what has happened in the Bay Area around evictions and displacement for the past 10 years, but also the voices of people who've been contesting that, and bring those things together. So we think of this, and we think of, all of our work as counter mapping. So mapping against, normative, what is often colonial mapping. And we wanted to document and have this print document of the work we've been doing, but the work that all these people in the Bay Area have been doing to contest these processes and to analyze them. And so for us, it was really about bringing together our maps with like all these other voices and offering this analysis. We hope that this atlas, like this counter atlas, serves, sorry, I have a loud cat, serves as like an example. We want to do it in other places. So I said our project moved to LA and New York. And so like our next idea is that we make they make these sort of counter atlases of New York and LA as well, also to document the sort of, gentrification and changes that have happened in these places, but also like the deep levels of resistance that have gone alongside it. One of my favorite pieces in our book is a piece that comes at the very end when we asked a second grade classroom to counter map their neighborhood and to sort of like highlight the important places for them. And it's just the sweetest thing. It's like, this is our favorite like flower garden, and this is our favorite. And I just think it shows like this alternative geography, right, of the Bay Area. And that, goes against the grain of this like speculative real estate, global capital geography of the Bay Area. So we really hope people get a different way of looking at that space from this book.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Siobhán, you've spoke to some of the inspiration and some of the inspiration for your book and some of your aims for the book, some of the goals for the book. Maybe you could say a bit more about what you want readers to take away. And
yeah, absolutely. The first thing we wanted to really do was to take a bigger picture view, both historically and geographically, instead of jumping from so-called crisis to crisis around the world, looking at migration and debates around migration from a different perspective, identifying similarities in what governments or corporations are doing, partly so that we can also highlight what activists are doing in those different places in response, so that people can be creating solidarity and creating networks transnationally. I think any kind of activist work that's focused around borders needs to take a transnational perspective. We also wanted to, just thinking about what Manissa was just saying, we wanted to give people hope. It's a very heavy book in the end and quite distressing and depressing, I think, at turns. But we wanted people to be able to, between the lines, sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly, identify ways that they could feel that they could take action in the world, whether it's divesting their money from banks that fund for-profit detention centres, or whether it's just shifting the narratives in the way that they speak about migrants or the way that they act in their workplaces. So we wanted to take this kind of big view and at the same time have an impact at the kind of the small level as well.
thank you. So now let me turn things over to Rebecca, who's going to be moderating our Q&A and our discussion. We would invite anyone to raise their hand and ask a question orally, or if they prefer to put it in the chat, that would be fantastic too.
Absolutely. Who would like to get us started? Thank you, Miranda. Miranda says she's proud of her professors in the Anthro department for these works, and extra props to all of us for securing such beautifully designed book covers. Mine was an effort, I will tell you that.
Could I ask a question?
Yes, absolutely.
It seems to me that all of these books, at one level or another, are well, they're doing a lot of things, but I wonder if some of the authors, and I don't have a preference for who, could talk about the connections between bodies, like the physical embodiment of the containment, the displacement, the architectures or the corsets. And I think, and I would maybe want to stretch that question of bodies and the impact on bodies of these strategies of capital, states, conservation organizations, educational institutions, whatever, to also the physical places where they end up intervening. So I guess there's human or animal bodies, and then there's also the physical place where these interventions and destructions and displacements happen. So I'm wondering, I mean, I would just leave it open to whoever wants to respond.
I think that would be a really good one for Siobhán, Manissa, and Buck, actually, if one of you want to step in.
So if I understand the question correctly, the connection between like bodies and these physical places. Yeah. So, you know, so our book is obviously all about place, right? Like the whole book is about the San Francisco Bay Area. It's like incredibly focused on this one region. And one of the things in our maps that we have been really concerned about and put a lot of thought into is how in the process of map making, we don't also just reduce the people whose lives live, who experience those places, right, in very particular ways. And so that's been this sort of balance that we really, in the project since it started, that we've really tried to achieve. And we've done some of that through using oral history. So we have an entire part of our project, you know, we call ourselves an activist mapping, oral history, and data visualization collective. And so part of the project, and this is on the online form, is we have an oral history map that goes alongside our eviction map. So along with the evictions, you can hear like oral histories of people who were evicted from those places or who lived in those places or contesting their evictions. And in the book, we have really tried, we've both excerpted those oral histories in the book. So throughout the book, there are like 2-page long excerpted oral histories alongside our data visualizations. But we've also, you know, I mentioned this like 2nd grade classroom. We've also really tried to include people's stories, like not just oral history interview style, but actually like ask people to, and activists in particular who've been working in the Bay Area, to like write their stories into this book, so that we have these like really detailed maps and data visualizations, but that go next to sort of more affective and personalized and embodied stories. So, you know, the chapter I worked on is called Speculation and Speculative Futures, and it's really looking at finance capital in the Bay Area and how displacement financing has worked. But we do that alongside a broad history of speculation and a history of redlining, but also stories and poems from people sort of talking about how they experience, you know, speculative capital and redlining. So that's how we try to bring it together. I can show some pictures if anyone's interested, but I'll also let Siobhán and Buck answer the question as well.
Sure, yeah, I think in the book, there's a lot of focus on trauma and death and psychological as well as physical trauma. And so in many ways, that is a big focus. And I think it's important to recognize well that a lot of conversations around migration are centered around this idea of kind of too many bodies. So there's not enough jobs for these people. There's not enough resources for these people. There's not enough space for these people, which is a fiction around the idea of distribution and unequal distribution, when we don't talk about the unequal distribution of capital in the same ways. But that said, I'm very mindful to think about not to reduce people to bodies, because that's such an easy slip when we talk about mass trauma. So, you know, how many people have died in the border, how many people are held in detention, that kind of thing, and then it becomes a counting game. But I think it is about necropolitics, but also about asking what people, what bodies matter, whose bodies matter, and who are counted as people and who are counted as bodies. So I think it's a really important question, but it's one that I think has to be dealt with a little bit critically or reflectively in conversations around migration, because we want to push against this kind of reduction to people as bodies or numbers. So yeah.
In considering space and bodies, one thing about my work in Williamsburg is how different it is when a very colonized looking space. I mean, colonial Williamsburg is one of the only locations where the word colonial is seen to be positive, as in like a decorative aesthetic. But repopulating those spaces with native peoples transforms the way in which both the public as visitors, but also faculty and staff perceive that space. So to have, I'd say at the beginning, before we began archaeology, to have a ground blessing ceremony where we invited descendant communities to come to sing honor songs, because then consultation, they wanted to, without bodies, they wanted to commemorate the spirits of those that had gone and lived in that space and gone on before, who may not have been remembered for a very long time, to think about those students who were there. And the administration, I think, became moved by the power of populating the space with so many native peoples, and to hear the voice, both in song, but also the remarks given by the Bradford and Legacy group. And it shifted the conversation in that space. But one challenge of doing applied work, as my colleagues know, is if you don't document, photograph, illustrate, narrate, when the event is over, when the program is over, that people go home and go back to their locations or whatever it may be. And so one aspect of the book for me is to recognize place and transform its the positionality by which people think about that as a colonized space, and maybe think about it in a different context in terms of sovereignty and diplomacy and treaty making, for one, but two, to document that repopulation and the return of native peoples to that space after displacement, and to record that for people to have that. So it's not a new history, but it's pulling back that curtain that shroud that's been over that public memory for such a long period of time, and allowing a space, or encouraging a space for a different dialogue.
Excellent, thank you all. Maya, I'm gonna come back to your question because I definitely want to see Manissa's pictures. But the question by John is a particularly interesting one. He says, maybe many of you seem to have tried to engage and influence wider audiences and non-academic entities through the use or not using jargon and through the choice of publisher. Have you felt this was successful, and how can you measure this influence? I'm going to go ahead and take this one, and then I'll open it up to the wider authorship for other answers. I think I have been successful with this, and I'm measuring that basically by Twitter engagement and by engagement with my publisher. My book got immense amounts of pre-orders, partially based on the cover and the cross-disciplinary interest it generated. This is not just for archaeologists, this is also for corset historians or fashion historians, or people who are interested in dress and culture. And I've been approached by several of my readers to say that it was incredibly readable, very jargon-free, very well explained, and if they had questions, they felt comfortable enough with my social media engagement to come to me to ask them. And my publisher has been nothing but supportive. My editors are fantastic, and we worked very hard to get to this tone where it could be approachable and open and as non-academic as an academic adjacent press could get. Who else would like to answer that?
I can say a couple of things. I also specifically chose my press, the University of Minnesota Press, because they would allow me to have a little bit more freedom in. Obviously, it's a very well respected academic press, and it's an academic book for academic audiences primarily. But my editor was also interested in supporting my personal interest in writing a book that had some more literary sensibility to it, I guess. And I've read a lot of books from the press that were kind of in the line of approach that I was hoping to take with my book. I don't know if I can measure its success. I think to me, like, part of what I have to do with my research that kind of is a continuation of the book is also to publish my work in journals that are read by conservationists. And so I have an article under review right now that is attempting to do that, kind of take some of these insights from the book. And I've done further research with people who sit in the centers of transnational conservation organizations. And so it's an article that's really trying to take the insights from the book and provide them to the audience of people who may elect not to take up an ethnography, regardless of how jargon-light it is.
I could say a quick word about that too. You know, writing for broad public audiences has been an aim of mine since graduate school as part of a larger movement in anthropology, away from the kinds of very insular conversations that sort of dominated anthropology, or a lot of anthropology, in the 1970s, 80s, parts of the 90s. I will say, having this, The United States of War was published by a university press, and a prior book was published by a commercial press. And both, I think, have had their advantages, but the sad, honest truth is that the commercial press just has a bigger marketing arm and mechanism, and it has more power and influence in the media industry. That's not, you know, there's some academic press books that do get tremendous attention, like Thomas Piketty's book on inequality was Harvard University Press, but there are limitations to most university presses because of their size and economic power. But I guess regardless of press, I've always seen a book as a kind of political tool, and one that we can use in a number of ways and can build on. That when you put a book out into the world, that's not the end point, but instead a starting point to write op-eds and to use the book in a variety of media, including increasingly, I'm thinking about TikTok, but to use the book in a variety of media to get attention for the central ideas that you're trying to communicate and for the contribution you're trying to make.
Whoops. Thank you for that, David. Let's go back to Maya's question. Can Manissa discuss more about countermapping as a methodology and how participants engaged with the activity? Were affective aspects of the process documented as well? And do please, let's see some of those pictures.
Yeah, sure. So I'll just say that counter mapping, let me just share my screen really quickly, and then just don't want to take up too much more. Oh, host disabled participant screen sharing. Okay, so when David gives me access, I'll do that. But I'll just say that, you know, there's so much. Oh, awesome. Thank you. I was going to say that there's a lot of data in the world right now, right? We live in a very data heavy world with technology, and data tells stories, right? And so a lot of, especially in terms of mapping, the mapping we see, the data we see tells a certain kind of story. And so our counter mapping is really trying to map against that grain and map processes of dispossession and displacement versus a lot of the real estate sort of or investment maps you see. And so I'll just show some really quickly to give people a sense, and then, but I don't want to take too much more time because I would like, you know, other people to answer questions that are more applicable to the whole group. So this is our first chapter, Evictions and Root Shock. And so alongside in the book, alongside maps like this, we also have like activist graphics. So this is our Ellis Act map. And then this is going alongside a picture of an anti-eviction protest. So this is how we were trying to bring together like maps and pictures to get to these affective dimensions that you're talking about, Maya. This is also like, these are photos. I mean, these are pictures from protests. So you can sort of see combined with essays. This is a map of unlawful detainers, which is a way evictions happen in the Bay Area. And then sort of a data visualization of how unlawful detainers happen. So this is just one chapter. And then it's next to a comic about anti-eviction protesting. So we were trying to bring together like data next to all these other things. Here's a map of anti-Black racism in San Francisco. And then we put that next to an oral history excerpt here, which is about the story of Edwin Lindo and the sort of telling his narrative about realizing that he suddenly became like a foreigner in his own neighborhood. And so we're trying to counterpose these things. I'll stop sharing. Hopefully that gets to some of what you're asking about, Maya, and I'm happy to talk to you more about how we made these sorts of maps and the nitty gritty of it. Yeah.
Are there more questions? We don't have any in the chat right now, but feel free to put them into the chat or raise your hands. Go ahead, David.
Well, it strikes me that mapping is actually a tool that at least several of us have used, and I wonder if anyone else, Kareem or anyone else, wants to talk about the importance of mapping or visuals more broadly as part of the work they're producing.
I can just say that one of the things about the context I work in is that there are all these different political agreements and jurisdictions and things like this that overlap and govern what can happen on the land for different kinds of populations, depending on where they are. And so I did do some work with the assistance of Megan Snow, who used to work at American University, was the director of geospatial research there, and who was tremendously helpful. She made maps that really helped show some of the things that I was trying to talk about changes in land tenure, sort of building with respect to various political agreements, the Oslo Accords most specifically. And it's something that I hope to take into my next work much more centrally. So the maps were extremely helpful in trying to demonstrate some of the things that I was talking about, the lines from the Oslo Accords, changes in land tenure from the Ottoman period, British land registration into the present, things like that. So, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Kareem. So Siobhán, I was wondering if you could expand on the comment you put into the chat about prices and really sort of working towards getting your book out there, pitching the op-eds and interviews and stuff.
This is just to add to what David had said, and to John, I think it was John's question about it's less about measuring the influence, which I'm not sure is really possible. Maybe that's a longer term aim, but I think just making sure that the book is accessible to people is really important. And so PM Press does things like occasional $1 ebook sales, and that's something that I think is really important to get out. A lot of our target audience are people who have migrated themselves or who've been kind of touched by the asylum regimes that are very damaging to people's incomes and resources as well. So that really helps. But also just, I guess, related to the question of how using visuals can tell stories in different ways, whether it's data visualization, maps, or photos, or whatever it may be. I think podcasting has really boomed in the last decade, but particularly over the last year. There's a lot of people are getting a lot of screen fatigue, but wanting to engage in conversations in different ways. So I pitched a couple of interviews and to talk about the book with relevant podcasts in the UK for UK audience, and sometimes surprising audiences. So I did one with a kind of a very anti-capitalist podcast that's more humorous and run by comedians, which didn't really necessarily seem as a good outlet, but actually was a good way to have a conversation about a very difficult and a traumatic subject in a more light-hearted way, if that's even possible, but to reach different audiences. So I think definitely as not using jargon is vital in the spoken environment, I think, spoken word environment. So yeah, I think that there's ways of reaching people that might not necessarily be about getting the book in their hands, but still the ideas from the books can kind of permeate in different formats.
I absolutely agree with that. I am all over the podcasts, even though I hate hearing myself speak to people. But I love the opportunity to be able to speak to people and to really continue to emphasize the ideas that are present in my books. Miranda asks, for those who did interviews, how were your works received by the people who participated in your ethnographies? So the participants as readers. Anyone want to take that one?
I can only offer in a way. It's sometimes hard. I've been in communities where an academic has shared the book, and I am the next person that is the recipient of that book from the said community. In terms of people's engagement with academic reading. However, I will say in the visual world, in terms of media and photographs and content, seeing the work shared all over social media by the community members, I would say tends to be a positive affirmation of their participation in the said project, to see themselves reflected in the project, and then to see multiple years thereafter of lamenting the project's coming to a conclusion or not being a part of the project any longer, and still posting and posting and posting. So I mean, some of those types of digital relationships have been, I think, indicative. Whereas the response to the reading may not be as much because their engagement deals with art, or their engagement deals with music or performance and theater in some way, as opposed to the academic parts of it. But I will say one outcome would be to have an editor, a co-editor who's a chief of the Eastern Shawnee, as being one of the individuals to invite a piece for another book. So in that way, there is, I think, a kind of a back and forth, at least for mine, of text as well as media. This is what I meant.
Annie, would you have a different perspective on that? I recall you did interviews in the course of your writing.
Yes, I did a lot of interviews over the course of 18 months living in the field. Yeah, I guess to me, there are different ways in which I've presented my research back to the people among whom I conducted research. When I was still in the field, I spoke a lot about my ideas and the ways that we do as anthropologists in order to achieve new understandings of as well as after I came home, I've constantly been in contact with some of the conservationists among who I did my research. I have a meeting with one of them again tomorrow. And so I'm constantly talking and re-talking about the book. I don't know if they have negative impressions, then maybe they wouldn't still be talking to me. So I don't really know how to answer the question, besides saying that I'm still in touch with these people and they still seem to want to hang out with me. So even, over Zoom.
Tony asks in the chat, Adrienne and Siobhán, does your book include a contribution from someone that deals with the role asylum officers or judges hearing deportation cases play?
Yes, there's a couple of chapters that do that. One from the perspective of someone who was seeking asylum and having how they were heard by the judge. Also, Adrienne's chapter talks about how judges respond and how her relationship is with judges. We didn't get any submissions from judges who wanted to contribute to the book, not necessarily surprisingly, but we do have a number of chapters as well that focus on the experiences of guards in detention centres. One looking at the dynamic in France, where the use of migrant labour in these low-paid, really challenging jobs. It's a really important dynamic that was identified because there was one interviewee of Louise Tassin, who wrote this chapter, he was working as a security guard in a detention centre. His own grandfather had been held there as a migrant, many years prior. And there's also a graphic novella chapter called A Guard Story, which I think it's about training in Australia. I can show a bit of this if I can screen share. Is that possible? Let's see.
You should be able to.
Let's scroll down here. So this is a chapter from Australia that was put together by journalists working together after interviewing a guard who was trained by Serco. And this is, I think, a way of telling a story that would not necessarily evoke much empathy or sympathy as the perspective of someone who is seen as in a kind of punitive role. But I think it does a really good job of drawing parallels. So there's an image here, for example, of how a prison and detention centre being cloaked can be the same thing. And so I think that these kind of ways of telling the perspective of people who maybe wouldn't necessarily be sympathetic characters in this play are seen in that way.
Excellent, thank you. Are there more questions?
Maybe we should go around for a final word or two from each of the authors, and in reaction to any of the other authors or any final thoughts that they haven't had a chance to share yet.
That sounds great. Shall I take that or shall you take that? Okay. Let's start with you, David.
Great. I'm so glad we got some visuals, and in some ways I apologize that we didn't bring more visuals into the conversation because they do enliven things. So I thought I would just share, some maps were at the center of my book in many ways, actually inspired by Manissa's work from the first time I met her virtually. This is one of the maps, one of 28 maps in my book that attempts to, on its own, communicate a different vision and understanding of what the United States is. So often we just see the 48 states or maybe the 50 states and forget about the US colonies. In addition to the US colonies, the collection of about 800 US military bases outside the 50 states and Washington, DC. So it's, what this map is attempting to do, and I have a black and white version. I'm thinking of turning it into a children's placemat, which seems like it might be fun. Just one other example. This is a map of what the United States, or part of the United States, would look like if surrounded by Russian, Chinese, North Korean, and Iranian military bases. Of course, none of these military bases exist. So this is a hypothetical map asking people in the United States in particular to consider how they would feel if the United States, this part of the United States, was surrounded by these military bases of supposed enemies, and then to look at what the actual situation looks like with US military bases surrounding Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Yeah, we'll leave it there.
Excellent, thank you. Let's have Buck go next.
All right, thanks. In the theme we're working with here on maps, I love maps, historical, new ones, etc. They can really communicate. Visuals help so much. And in my volume, I mean, there's so much photography and document reproductions and object reproductions, but this was a very large scale map that I had both in an exhibit at the Muscarelli as well as on a department level exhibition. And it shows upwards of 50 different native sovereign communities that had a relationship to this particular institution in the space where Harvard only has 4 known 18th century native students. Princeton has just a handful from one community. This Brafordin school demonstrated the depth and breadth of political engagement with Virginia as a colonial occupier in the time, cross-cutting so many different language groups, but also a distribution of those communities today, and speaks to displacement and removal and other issues. And this is a partnered map with, also comparing whether their federal status today or recognized in a state capacity or non-recognized. But this type of illustration, I think, can help demonstrate, at least to those who doubt the history or doubt the older relationships, because I often would, how many people really? And, as if, because it's different now than it was then. And that's something that I think Native communities also took great pride in, very carefully looking at those maps and seeing where their specific community was and who else was on the map, to be able to confirm their status in the period when when they were master and commanders of a larger geography. So it became map making, both can communicate, but it also can be a sense of power in the present, I think, for thinking about the past. Thank you.
Wonderful.
And I should say, I have to leave for class. So I'm teaching in 10 minutes. So thank you all. It's been great. I look forward to seeing everyone again soon.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Buck.
Let's have Kareem next.
Sure. I mean, if it's just last words, I mean, I guess I was thinking about the question of the extent to which we've been successful, and I guess I have no idea, and it's not up to me. And I think that that's one of the sort of mortifying things about having a book exist. But I mean, I have what I think I did, what I hope people think I did, and we'll see what happens. But I mean, I guess that yeah, I hope people look at it and think through it.
Wonderful, thank you. Annie?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess one of us has to be the contrarian, so I'll be that person. And instead of answering a question, I'm going to ask one, which is to both Tom and I guess Dan and Tom, I guess, which is, where are we going to have the room for these new book covers in our building? Maybe we need to get another building, or I'm not exactly sure.
I agree with Annie. We should get a new building.
Yeah, I think there's a line. I think there's a line that's already formed for that. Yeah.
All right, Manissa, how about you?
Thanks.
Yeah.
I should just mention, for those who haven't been to our building, the Hamilton building, we have a fantastic collection of book covers, framed book covers, that is thanks to Annie Klaus, putting them on the wall and doing the work of getting them printed so beautifully. And we have editions.
Yes, thank you, Annie, for that. And we're very excited to have Annie's book cover up there with the rest of them. I guess, yeah, if this is just last words, I guess I'll just say, thinking what Kareem said about success, our book is not out yet. It is coming out this summer. It was supposed to be out by now, but everything has been slowed down, as we all know. And so, you know, we always envisioned we'd throw this like big book party in the Mission and be like a dance party and everyone would come. And I just want to say that we're holding out for that next year. And so we're trying to be positive about the fact that the book will be out this summer in July or August, that maybe we can also have the dance party and fundraiser that we want to have to go along with it. And yeah, we'll see. I don't know, success means a lot of different things when it comes to, I think, putting this sort of work out in the world. Like, people reading it is one version of success, people talking about it, doing the sort of publicity that Siobhán was talking about. For us, honestly, this project, this book we've been working on, we started working on it in 2017, and it's been so much work bringing all these contributors together and making these maps that we had on an online format, making them into a print format. It's been hours, and we did this all as a collective process. So there's 6 like main editors, but like we were working overall with like 150 contributors. So we are just really proud of ourselves that it's even coming out and that it looks good. So like that's our success right now, honestly.
Absolutely. Siobhán, why don't you go, please?
Yeah, just on success, one of the feedback we got the most was that the book smelled good. So I guess that's great to hear from numerous people. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for everyone for coming, and David for organising, and everyone for making the time, because I think this conversation really demonstrates that anthropology as a discipline has many different registers and can have impacts at many different levels, and stories can be told in so many different ways, which is important as the discipline and as many social sciences and humanities are under threat around the world. So I hope you get the new building. I hope there's lots of money put towards anthropology at AU and elsewhere, because it's obviously a discipline and a register that can have an impact on the world. Change it maybe, but definitely have some kind of spark there. So thank you everyone for coming.
And I will finish off by sharing one last map. This is the map of the boundaries of where my skeletons would have come from. This is St. Bride's Parish. So the church is here. And then I mapped all of the known locations of death for the women from my skeletal collection. The skeletal collection only had 125 women, but the archives showed a considerable number more. So this represents 3,815 women over the course of about 80 years. And it's incredible to think that I can share their stories now, and that how they lived and the ways in which they lived and the ways in which they died can be so impactful hundreds of years later. I also want to thank everybody for coming and thank David for organizing. This has been great.
So yeah, sorry, at the important moment, I knocked my headphones out. But thank you to everyone for coming, especially in a time when everyone is zoomed out and has so many events. Really a fantastic conversation. And I think we all look forward to continuing the conversation and the work we do together. So thank you all for joining us and for the support. And we look forward to seeing everyone again soon.